Over
very
to you,
much.
Alex.
Good morning, all. So just introduced and to reiterate, I'm the landscape officer with Southampton District Council and West Devon District Council. So my role is as a professional consultee, most frequently to the landscape planners and the DM planners who have the applications for dealing with renewables or any application within the districts, and I provide them with advice and guidance on the impacts of those developments. And also then obviously I speak to our members and give them similar advice. So a brilliant topic to be discussing. Obviously it's my passion, so that's landscape. Just working out how to advance that. Is that changing on screen? Doesn't seem to be advanced.
Usually at the bottom left-hand corner of your slide, there'll be a, yeah. We're moving.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
That's it. We're working now. Great. Okay, so this slide sets out basically what I'm going to talk about and what we need to be covering. So the first thing is to understand landscape. You know, I'm often asked that question, what is landscape? And I think landscape means different things to different people. So it's really important that people understand there are differences in how we perceive the landscape, but it has been defined as most things are. So the European Landscape Convention described it as an area perceived by people whose character is the result of action and interaction of natural and human factors. So that quite neatly summed it up to explain how landscape is created by people, and that's often a discussion that we have, but it's also then created by much bigger forces. So it's that natural environment and how it's been affected. So the landscape as we perceive it is going to be different to everybody, and how we think it is and what we believe in it. But those words crop up again right the way through the presentation in how we deal with impacts on landscape. Clearly then there's a landscape policy. So all the context of dealing with planning applications, including onshore renewables, it needs to be carried out and assessed within a framework. That's at both a national level, so we have a national policy framework, and also then at a local level. And those local level is plans that are developed by local people with input from the communities, but also then it's very relevant to the local area in which those policies are being applied. So again, they will vary across the whole of the county. So Devon will have lots of local plans, and each of those will be discussing and setting policy that's really important to that local area and understanding it. But also that guides decisions that are then made. And we've already had that, you know, discussed with Ian and Johnny about how any decisions are made within a policy framework and how those can influence the outcomes of those decisions. Again, really important we discuss and look at protected landscapes, very relevant to Devon. We've got Dartmoor and Exmoor National Parks, and we've got 5 AONBs, areas of outstanding natural beauty. So those carry themselves even more policy protection, and for good reason, in terms of those very special landscapes. And you need to have a framework in which to manage those and look after them. So again, each of those will have a management plan and guidance provided that will inform people and communities and decision makers about how we should treat applications that come forward within those areas. And because of that extra tightness around protecting those landscapes, obviously it can have a big impact and influence over decisions when we have developments that potentially have a greater impact and effect upon them. So obviously we then move on to how do we assess the impacts of onshore wind turbines on the landscape. So that's going to be the next slide. Checking my running order here. So landscape character, that's the way we understand the landscape and then allow us to understand how we make decisions about what affects that landscape. So across the whole of Devon, we look at landscape characters. That's the bigger context. So we need to understand what the characteristics of these landscape are. Now, again, there are 3 systems in place to allow us to do that. And I often refer to it as like a filtering system, a sieve. So you've got the coarsest level at the top and the finest level at the bottom. So there are national landscape character areas. Devon has 7 of those. So they divide up parts of the county into different character types. So the south of Devon is quite different to the north of Devon. So there's scripts and an assessment of those spaces, and so we understand what that's about. Then each of the local authorities and the counties, they also then analyse that landscape, and Devon has 68 character areas, so that breaks it down again. So each of those are a bit more concentrated on a specific area, and that allows us to understand what that landscape is and how it's different. So clearly people will know, those that know Devon and Cornwall, is that the moorland has very different characteristic to the coastline. So we recognise those characters and we understand them, and that allows us then to think about the context of any, for example, you know, in terms of today's discussion, any onshore energy formation, how that will impact on those characters. And then at a local level, so this is really getting to the bottom of the sieve now, the finer detail is 37 landscape character types. So again, that's looking at valleys, so it's much more specific. It's looking at coastline, so there might be cliffs along the south coast or the north coast of Devon. So you'll have a character type that describes that. And by understanding all these characteristics, as I say, we begin to build a picture and understanding about when you introduce something to that landscape, what sort of impacts it can have, whether they're positive or negative or neutral. They may not have an impact at all. And that's obviously then really important when we're looking at broader schemes where you've got large onshore wind farms, or even down to individual single wind turbines and how that might affect. So once we understand and we know there's a context in which to assess a landscape against landscape character, we then have a process of assessing that landscape. So again, it's important we have guidance and understanding about how we're interpreting that, and that makes it a much more open and transparent process. And effectively, those that are wanting to put in the wind turbines, they will have to go through the process of doing a landscape and visual impact assessment. So they will be assessing what they think the impacts of that development could be. And then similarly, us in receiving that application, we have to understand how that's going to impact on. So we assess their landscape visual impact assessment, and effectively we're making our own assessment at the same time. That itself is broken down into 2 really important areas. So I've talked a bit about the landscape character. So that's what makes up that landscape. Individual features and parts of the landscape that are in it, because obviously they vary. And it creates that evidence base, and they articulate what people perceive and experience and value as distinctive in that landscape. So, you know, a landscape character will be looking at the larger formations, valleys, plateaus, that side of things, but it'll also then be looking at elements within it. So hedgerows, woodlands, how those are all made up. They're distinctive combinations and specific to those areas within the county that we're looking at. So they're very, very localized. We also have Devon Landscape Policy Group. So that's a group of all the officers across Devon. And because of the importance and the potential impacts around renewables, we've developed a guidance note. So again, this is another way of helping people to understand and to guide people through the process of understanding about how we deal with specific types of development. And that advice note was very useful because it began to influence how applications came in and how we assessed different proposals. So it looked at how we accommodate wind and solar PV, because that's another point that Johnny was making. It's not always just about the wind turbines here. It's renewable energy has lots of different forms, and we need to make sure that when we're considering those, how they sit within the landscape and what's the best way of delivering them. So there is going to be times where you have to think about where those positions are. So if you place a wind turbine on the top of a ridge against the skyline, it's going to be much more obvious than if you brought it down into the valley itself. So to conclude, we're going to be looking at, quickly look at a case study. So this is the case study that was in, not one that I dealt with myself, but it is an application in West Devon. So this illustration shows I've drawn the little white markers on it. So you can see where those turbines are. What you can see is the shadows from the wind turbines, but that's effectively how they'd be stood up in the landscape. So this is Denbrook Wind Farm near Oakhampton. And the reason I'm showing this is to just give you that idea about the impacts. And it was Ian that talked about, how communities accept these and how they respond to applications, and how that has stifled delivery of much of this. So this was a proposal for 9 wind turbines. And the whole process would have gone through of looking at the landscape character type, how those wind turbines would impact on that landscape. And those are the sorts of decisions you're going to be thinking about, is if you support, the principle of wind turbines, it'll then be drawn into this planning process. And that planning process will go through a whole set of assessments and understandings to see what those impacts would be. And that was done for the Denbrook application. So these were 120 metre to the tip wind turbines and creating 18 megawatts. Again, what's important with this one is its relationship to protected landscapes. This was outside of Dartmoor National Park, so it's still 6 kilometres from it, but it could still have an impact upon it. So again, it had to have those considerations. And as we've alluded to, the process of getting this through can be very long. The LPA in this case, West Devon, recommended refusal of the application because of the level of concern about it. So we would have gone through landscape visual impact assessment and lots of community engagement. So as that community engagement was what we're seeing here, people have a right to comment and respond to these applications, and they do. So for this application for 9 turbines had 2,915 letters of objection. So that really highlights the issues that arise and how people are passionate about certain things, but ultimately they respond negatively to the proposal for these wind turbines. And I've just put a couple of quotes up there about how they describe that. They talk about inefficient, ugly monstrosities. They also often mention environment. So they say they're protectors and supporters of the environment, but when it comes down to an individual application, they will still be opposed to it because of the impacts it'll have on them directly. And that's the real dichotomy here and the real difficulty in getting this through. People talk about natural beauty, tranquility. Tranquility is peace and quiet. So how that could be disrupted by a wind turbine in that landscape. So these are really important to them. And here we are with the climate emergency, having to think about those things. And suddenly we're having to balance that against the reality of how we deal with it. And that's where, as I say, the difficulty comes in. People protect our environment, unique aspects of Devon. Arguably, renewables are protecting the landscape. Now, to balance the argument, there was 71 letters of support. So we did get some support.
Yep.
And again, interesting to see, obviously, a lot less than the 2,000. But useful information there about how people debate and discuss these things. And this is Devon Town's forum. So, across the whole of Devon, they broadly supported it. They understood the duty we have. They talked about duty of care to future generations. So that was the approach they thought was really important, and about tipping that balance. And of course, Friends of the Earth one would hope and expect. It's about tackling climate change. Now, this application was in 2005. So again, we've been discussing these issues around climate change for a very long time. And clearly that was being raised at that point, and the technologies that were around to help deliver. So that's my talk. A few references there. So I think you'll be circulating this. So these are opportunities for you to click on these when you get the PDFs, and they'll take you to the different parts of the information that we've got here. And that will help build out even more your understanding of the factors one needs to consider.
Okay, so thanks, Alex. And